It's the end of an era at CNN, albeit a short and tumultuous one. CEO Chris Licht is now out after just a year of leading the network. He came in last May as previous leader Jeff Zucker was pushed out. On his watch, among other things, Licht presided over the shutdown of CNN's documentary unit, the firings of Brian Stelter and Don Lemon, and a widely panned New Hampshire town hall with former President Donald Trump, who Licht said CNN would cover like any other candidate. Now CNN is in the market for a new leader and maybe a new strategy. So what should the network take away from the Licht era? And what lessons might there be for the rest of the media? Joining me to discuss are Susie Banikarim, editor-at-large at the Meteor, and Dan Lothian, a former CNN White House correspondent. He's now the executive producer of The World, produced right here at GBH. Good to see you both. Dan, let me start with you. As we mentioned, the Trump town hall preceded Licht's exit by about a month, and there was this very embarrassing for him piece in The Atlantic that cast him in a really negative light. Do you think that if not for those two developments, Licht would still be on the job?
I think he would still be on the job, but the clock would be ticking and moving very quickly. I mean, I think all of the conversations that we tend to have behind the scenes with our former, colleagues has been that this situation is untenable. That as much as the baggage that we all know about with Jeff Zucker, there was still that sense of Zucker was always engaged in the news process. I mean, that's where he comes from, rolling up his sleeves, being in the control room, being in editorial meetings. And this was someone who, by all accounts, was more detached and not really plugged into the day-to-day, but more to what can I do to either make my bosses happy or turn things around on a dime. But ultimately, I think there was not a winning situation. I didn't see a winning situation for him. Certainly what happened here recently accelerated it at all.
And we should mention, as some of our viewers will know, he made that detachment that you mentioned manifest, right? He shut down Jeff Zucker's old office, which was in the newsroom, turned it into a conference room and moved a few floors up. And that sends a pretty strong message, obviously. Susie, what's your take on that? If these two things hadn't happened, the town hall and the embarrassing Atlantic takedown, would he still be there?
Yeah, I agree with Dan. I think that he would still be there, but his days would probably still be numbered, partially because what both of those events, the Atlantic article and the town hall reveal, is just colossally bad news judgment, right? Like the idea that you would just give Trump a live hour with a bunch of Trump activists essentially
super
in the
diehards, yeah,
doesn't make sense, right? I think that's just bad judgment, and this sort of goes with an arrogance that was revealed in that profile. But also, it's incredibly arrogant to think you're going to give someone like Tim Alberta, who is a very good journalist, the kind of access he did, and then hope that the article is somehow not going to reveal some real truths about you. And there were just these really embarrassing moments in that article. There was that sort of bizarre moment where he's working out and he says, Jeff Zucker could never do this.
That's the one I was thinking of, yeah.
Such bad judgment. And that means that he didn't deserve to be in that job. So I kind of feel like, yeah, he'd still be there, but if you have that kind of judgment, it would come out in other ways, right? You have to be able to actually think through what you're doing in a reasonable way to have that job.
Yeah. I mean, no good can come from some interview where someone's with you over a year, because it may be that you did wonderful things behind the scenes, but 5 little things were said and done in that moment where you got used to the reporter. You put them all together, and it looks really bad in a story. And I would have never allowed that.
If you're a journalist who doesn't know that giving a journalist that kind of access is not going to behoove you, that is a really bad sign.
I have to say, I am cagier when it comes to the media than most non-journalists I know, and I think most journalists think the same way as I do. I would never want to open myself up that way. Susie, the vision that Chris Licht had, editorially speaking, for CNN just happened to be the same vision that his boss, David Zaslav, the Warner Brothers Discovery CEO, has for what CNN should be. I want to roll a little bit of Zaslav talking about what he'd like CNN to be moving forward, and then kick around the question of whether that's even tenable. Let's take a look at how Zaslav puts it.
What we're going to do, what Chris Licht is going to do, is, as there are networks here that are advocating right and left, Chris is going to be advocating for truth. He's going to be advocating for facts. He's going to be advocating for journalism first. And I think, I think there's a very big lane for CNN. I think people in America they're looking for a place where people aren't yelling and giving opinions, and they're looking for more news. And so that's what you'll see from CNN.
That's back in 2022 when there were much higher hopes for Chris Licht. But Susie, I'm wondering, you and Dan and I are talking the day after the federal indictment of former President Trump, this unprecedented development in American history, incredibly fraught moment. Susie, do you think there's any way for any news organization to cover a story like that in a way that satisfies people on the right, in the center, and on the left?
I mean, I don't know that there's a way to satisfy everybody, but also you don't need to satisfy everybody to run CNN. There are 330 million people in the U.S., and a banner night on a cable channel is 3 to 4 million people. So that's how many people you are trying to reach realistically. And the people who are watching Fox are never going to change the channel to CNN. That's just not going to happen. So the reality is I think most journalists want to focus on truth and journalism with a capital J or whatever, as Zaslav was saying. That's not the issue, but you also do have to give people a real sense of stakes, right? At the end of the day, cable news is a form of entertainment, and that's something Jeff Zucker knows better than almost anyone I've ever worked with. And that's what Chris Licht wasn't doing. Like, it's not about having a point of view. It's about actually communicating why something matters to your life. And I was watching CNN last night during that indictment, and it just felt really dry, right? And that's not something anyone's ever going to tune into.
Dan, do you think that's a reasonable goal for Zaslav to have?
Look, I think it is a reasonable goal. And frankly, I have worked with Jeff Zucker in the past at NBC, and what Zucker was able to do is to take news and make news entertaining. And I think that's good sometimes, but other times I would say he also went over the line, right? Mm-hmm. Because it really was about I have examples, of times when it was like, well, there's not much of a story there, but they'll be talking about it around the water cooler. So that's how he was. So when Chris came along and when I heard this, I thought, this is great, right? CNN is going to go back to kind of the basics, because in this time where you really do have this divided sort of publicly out on the streets, and when it comes to media, people have sides and they pick sides, and no matter what, you're not going to convince them to cross over. Maybe a few, you will. But in this time, it's really hard to appease everyone. What you can do, though, is really stick to some of the basics of news coverage. And you heard him talking a lot about that, but you didn't see anything happening. Mm-hmm. And then you had the drama playing out on the morning, where they shifted the morning show.
The Don Lemon, Caitlin Collins, Poppy Harlow experiment.
And so what I think needed to be done is you needed to sort of strip CNN down, remove some of these more sort of, if you had more extreme voices on some of the talk show elements and that kind of thing. I would have stripped it down and then built it up. It's very difficult to take what was there and all the stars that were in place and then say, okay, we're going to hit the switch and it's going to be something different. And I think that's the trouble that he ran into.
There's a point, I think, implicit, maybe becoming explicit in everything that we've been talking about so far, which is that there's the question of ideological point of view, but there's also the question of style and the extent to which you want to make the journalistic talent, to use an industry term, the stars of the show or not. And I'm thinking, for example, of the Jim Acosta confrontation with, I can't remember if it was the president or a spokesperson, it was with the president, where he refused to give up his microphone. There was a real sense in the Trump years, not just that CNN was critical of Trump, but also that they were performing, that they were becoming kind of a journalism reality TV show. And I will say that as I was reading that Atlantic profile that made Licht look pretty bad, his desire to have people pull back at CNN from that, I was sympathetic to that. That didn't seem unreasonable.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point of view, right? I think it's absolutely fair to say that the story shouldn't be about the journalists. And actually, interestingly, what Jake Tapper said in response to this Atlantic piece was that he didn't want CNN to be making news because of its CEO. I think it's fair to say you also don't want it to be making news because of its talent. But that's totally different than putting together that morning show that just didn't make any sense, had 3 people on it who you felt like would never even be willing to have dinner together, much less sit around a table together every morning. I think there's a difference between the sort of theoretical mission that Zaslav and Licht stated and execution. And I think this execution was really poor. I think there are ways to execute against that principle that are more interesting.
Well, you have perfectly anticipated the next question I wanted to run by you, too. Dan, I'll go to you first. Given that Zaslav's still in place, that he has this vision, and that Licht did seem to fall down when it came to executing it, do you expect whoever succeeds Licht to have the same ultimate goal in mind, but hopefully, from CNN's point of view, just get it done a lot more effectively? Or do you think there might be a more fundamental shift?
It's really, at this point, it's hard to predict what will happen. I certainly think that they want to head to the middle somewhere, because that's kind of the thinking now, right? If you can't win on the extremes, maybe there's something that we can get in the middle and grow from there. Let's get back to journalism. The problem is that CNN is also chasing ratings. And I think part of the problems that did happen early on with why do you keep Don Lemon around if he's this lightning rod, right? Well, he was getting really good ratings. So you're going to shift him from that one show. Maybe some of the people will follow with him. So sometimes you're making decisions for multiple reasons, editorial, because upper management wants something done. But other times, at the end of the day, is how are you paying the bills? And if the ratings continue to slide, then that creates a whole lot of pressure. And so I think the future will be decided based on what works. So if they start trying this and they find that people are coming back, they'll continue doing this. If it doesn't, they'll try this. And where does it end up? I don't think we know. Hopefully it ends up in a place where CNN is still around.
Susie, do you have the same sense of what the future is going to hold for the network as Dan?
Yeah, I don't think they're going to completely abandon this idea that they don't want to be seen as left. Although I think it's kind of interesting. There's a little bit of a rewriting of history of Zucker's era, because initially he was criticized for giving Trump too much airtime, right? So at first it was like, and I think it was fair criticism that he just gave Trump an open mic for many months during the campaign. And then there was a shift towards holding him accountable. I don't think those were ideological points of view. I think those were a response to something that they felt the audience was responding to.
Your point.
So I think that is absolutely the case, that you need to actually pay attention to the audience. You can't just decide what the audience wants and then sort of just commit to that without, recalibrating as you see what works and doesn't work. And I think the issue is not what kind of lane they want to run in. The issue is, do they have a vision for how to execute against that actually brings in an audience? And that's what it feels like Licht didn't have.
Dan, I have to ask you, before we wrap up, what's it like as a former CNN employee to watch all this tumult at a place that you used to call your professional home?
Well, it's tough. And I think twice before I wear a CNN hat. Not that I wear it all the time, but I sometimes I see it in the closet. I'm not going to put that on because I have to answer questions and all of that. But it's very difficult, especially I have conversations, texting all the time. When that article came out, immediately, before I even knew it came out, someone had sent it to me. Can you believe this, right? We're having these conversations, and it usually ends with, can you believe where this is, where CNN is, right? CNN certainly has been through quite a lot, but we haven't seen anything like this. And for a place where we knew, certainly when I went there and prior to that, it was a place where you can go and put your head down and break stories and cover, breaking news stories of the day or do long form. And that really is what we were spending a lot of our time on, not making TV or having shouting matches or trying to appeal to a particular side. And so there's great sadness, and this comes, as I was mentioning to you earlier, this comes on the heels of original CNNers and those, present day meeting in Atlanta recently because they were shutting down the main CNN headquarters there and then moving to where they first started, another building outside of sort of the downtown Atlanta area. And everyone was on social media talking about how it was great to be together, but also understanding this horrible place that CNN was in. So I think, for anyone who worked there a long time, I was there 11 years. Some obviously have been there much longer, but it's a place where you grew up in journalism, and it's tough to watch it go through what it is now.
Dan Lothian, Susie Banikarim, thank you both for talking this through. Good to see you both.
Thank you.